And without further ado, I am going to go ahead and get us to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nooshan Ashtari. Dr. Ashtari has taught languages, graduate and undergraduate courses, and has conducted research in various countries around the world for over 16 years. Her research interests include virtual reality in teacher training and professional development, reading and second language acquisition, and heritage language development. Her hope is that her research will help ensure that children of immigrants can communicate easily with their parents, grandparents, and relatives in the heritage language. Dr. Ashtari will talk about heritage language development, the importance of the print environment, and the special case of Farsi as a heritage language. So welcome, Dr. Ashtari. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson, and all the organizers of this event and all the attendees. It is my great honor to talk to you about heritage language development. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you can see my slides. All right, so since Professor Krashen, who's a very, very difficult act to follow, and I don't think anyone in our field can really follow his speeches, but it's a great honor to have me, so thank you. Since he so wonderfully emphasized the importance and the power of stories, I am going to start with a story, one that most of you or all of you probably know about, and that is the story of the Tower of Babel. So as you know, the story goes that after the Great Flood, the next generation of humans only spoke one language. One day they get together and they decide that we're going to build a tower. We're going to build a tower so high that it's going to reach heaven and it's going to reach God. God gets angry and says, I'm going to change everyone's languages so that they're not able to communicate with each other and they will not be able to continue building this tower. Now, when it comes to heritage languages, James Crawford came up with this beautiful term that sums up this phenomenon very clearly, and that is it has become Babel in reverse, meaning that many immigrants who move to different countries across the world, after a few years or after even one generation, there is heritage language loss. So there's a language shift, and they start speaking the language that is the main language of the country they reside in currently. So there's a language shift. Why is that important? According to United Nations reports for 2020, there are about 272 million immigrants in the world, and that number keeps increasing every single year. When we look at languages alone, only in countries that English is the main language of the nation, these are the statistics. So you can see in the United States, there are about 430 languages. In Canada, that number is more than 200. In Australia, more than 300 languages. And all of these languages could easily be lost within a few years or decades. Now, when it comes to heritage languages, research has shown again and again that it is all advantages and no disadvantages. Some of these advantages include cognitive advantages of knowing more than one language, economic advantages, there are more job and international business opportunities, biculturalism, and also this one, it's very close to my heart, and that is access to the wisdom of the elders and the heritage culture that can easily be lost within 1 or 2 generations. Now, we said that there are actually no disadvantages of developing a heritage language, but there are some disadvantages of not developing a heritage language. One of them is a communication gap that exists between parents, children, and grandparents and children. So sometimes parents and grandparents are not proficient in the language that these children speak, and they cannot communicate more than basic terms of hi, bye, very, very simple terms, and that connection is lost in this process. And also, for many heritage language acquirers and children of these immigrants, they feel a sense of isolation and exclusion, both from the ethnic community that is in abroad in these countries that they are currently in, and also from those of the home country, of the country of origin, because they're not really there, they're kind of in an in-between stage. There are some barriers to heritage language development. One of them, and the most important one, is lack of input. Even in a language such as English, where we have an ocean of materials and resources, we're still, as English teachers and instructors, we're still struggling to find compelling and comprehensible input, let alone all those languages where there is not enough material and reading materials and other kinds of materials or input that they can actually use. The second one, which Professor Krashen talked about in 1998, about language shyness. So language shyness refers to when heritage language speakers can speak the language, but they cannot speak it perfectly. So there are minor errors here and there. For example, when it comes to social class markers or politeness. For example, in languages such as French and German and Farsi, you have a different kind of you when you refer to your friends, and there's a different kind of you when you refer to somebody who's older than you or is in a different social class. So for example, in French, is the difference between vous and tu, and in German, it's sie and du. And then in Farsi, it's shoma and to. So even those very, very minor errors can really make you feel like an outsider in these cultures and in countries. And a lot of times what happens is that heritage language speakers are, they're considered to be native speakers of their heritage language. And when they don't meet that standard of a native speaker, they get criticized and ridiculed. And that leads to them not wanting to have as much interaction and as much input, and that means that it's less input, less proficiency. So these are two of the main barriers when it comes to heritage language development. Now, what I became very interested in was the case of Farsi. I am originally from Iran. I was born and raised in Iran. I didn't actually move here until my graduate studies. And Farsi, or Persian, is my native language. It is a language that is spoken in different countries around the world, mainly in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. And it has more than 110 million speakers around the world. In terms of immigrants, Iranian immigrants living abroad, there are different kinds of statistics because the numbers, I think, are not reported very accurately. There's one that it estimates it's around 3 million, but I assume that number is much higher. And most of these immigrants, especially after Iranian Revolution, they moved to the United States, particularly to California, Los Angeles, which is why it's gotten its nickname of Tehrangeles, or Little Persia. Now, when I moved here, I noticed that many of these Iranian American families, the next generations, don't really speak Farsi or use Farsi at all. And I wanted to see what the reasons are. But they usually say that the parents desire that their children speak Farsi, and the children want to acquire Farsi as well. So I started gathering data and interviewing these Farsi heritage language acquirers from 2011 onward. And it turned out that many of these students or Farsi heritage language acquirers do not improve beyond basic level of proficiency. So sometimes they can say very basic terms such as hi, how are you, bye, salam, khubi, khodafis, but nothing beyond that level. And for those living in Los Angeles, there are heritage language classes that they have been taking or they can take, but it turned out that most of these classes are not effective, and in general, they have been disliked by those taking them. One of the reasons for that is that they use very traditional methods of instruction, for example, and particularly grammar translation. So most of these heritage language acquirers were telling me that they have gone over the alphabet for sessions after sessions after sessions, and grammar points and sentence structures for hours and hours. And these classes are usually held during weekends. So these are the times that usually children just want to be with their friends and they don't want to take heritage language classes. And even the methods of instruction and the way the classes are held are not really helping them gain any interest in these classes as well. And a lot of times what happens is that these children get blamed and the parents get blamed. And sometimes they blame each other. So for example, children say, why didn't you teach me Farsi? And the parents say, why didn't you learn Farsi? So it's a cycle, it's a vicious cycle of blame going on and on when it comes to heritage language acquisition. Now I wanted to see why the reason, what the reasons are, and where the blame should actually be directed at. So one of the first steps was seeing the print environment in Farsi. And a good place to start was Farsi bookstores. Again, because the number of Iranians living in Los Angeles is around 500,000 to 1 million, and in this area, there are some Farsi bookstores here and there that people can go to. And it was very, very interesting that many of these Farsi bookstore owners said a similar sentence to the one that you see in red in the middle of this slide. And it says, the new generation does not speak Farsi, does not read Farsi. Now I wanted to see what the underlying reasons for this are. And it turned out there are three main reasons. One of them is lack of accessibility. And this was echoed in research done by Gharibi and Seals in 2019 for Farsi heritage language acquisition in New Zealand. And they found that one of the main issues was lack of appropriate teaching materials and books. That turned out to be the case in California as well. The bookstore owners were saying that we're losing customers and it's very difficult to get books from Iran and sell them. So we don't have many options available at this point. Another reason was lack of comprehensible materials. When they were asked about the #1 sellers of Farsi for Farsi instruction, they referred me to two main books. One of them was the Farsi's first grade Farsi textbook of Iran, not even the recent one, so the one that was used 40 years ago before the Iranian Revolution. And another one was another book called Learning Farsi, which was very similar in nature to the first grade book. Why are these options not really comprehensible for Farsi heritage language acquirers? One, they are designed for native speakers of Farsi. So when you think about a first grader, depending on the country, you are 6, 7 years old when you start your first grade. And all throughout those years from your birth until that age, you have been exposed to this language. But that is not the case for heritage language acquirers. That very first class might be their very first exposure to the language. So the book is definitely not comprehensible to them. Another factor is the age. So many Farsi heritage language acquirers are not at the age of a first grader. Some of them are adults in their 20s, 30s, 50s. Some of them are in middle school, high school. So getting a book that is a first grade book is definitely not comprehensible or compelling to them. And what happens is that many of these buyers of books or customers of these bookstores, they only buy the first level in a book, in a Farsi instruction book series. And that is not unique in terms of Farsi as a heritage language. It's also across the board in all languages, second languages, as well as Jeff McClellan's study also shows. And these bookstore owners were showing me these shelves of books that they had available. And they would show me the first level of Farsi books that they had sold some here and there. But then when it turned to level 2, level 3, and so on and so forth, maybe 1 or 2 or none of them were sold. And that was very interesting. And that seems to be the case for even language learning apps and websites. So a lot of these companies are only making money from the first level. So many customers or users or language learners come to these apps or, for example, websites, and they only go through the first few lessons. And then because it's not comprehensible enough, it's not compelling enough, it's not really helping them in their language acquisition journey, they just stop there. So that also happens to be the case in Persian. The third reason is lack of compelling options. Professor Mason and Professor Krashen, as Professor Krashen so wonderfully talked about in his talk, have emphasized this factor many, many times, that we don't only need to have materials and input, they also need to be compelling for the acquirers. And that seemed to be the case in Farsi as well. They kept telling me that we don't have any simplified books. We don't have any graded readers in Farsi. And even the ones that we have are not really interesting. Now that we know about Farsi bookstores, so we've looked at what we have available for people to buy, I wanted to see what is happening in libraries. Again, there's a high number of Iranians living in this area, so I wanted to see what we have available in libraries. I analyzed this 72 branches of LA public library system, and it turned out that for the 500,000 to 1 million Iranians living in this area, there were only 300 books available in Farsi. What is even more interesting is that only 12 of these books were checked out at the time that this study was being done, which was winter 2019. So that kind of tells you how compelling or uncompelling these options actually are. Now that we know that only 12 books were taken out of the libraries, we wanted to study this more. And we used this very fascinating research method, which is called unobtrusive measures. And Professor McMillan used it in his study with different languages. And the purpose of the study was to see, okay, now we don't know that these many books have been taken out from libraries. Now let's see how much of these books are actually read. There are certain criteria that you can look at. And you can do this with books that you have at home too, but it's even more significant when it comes to library books because so many people might take them out, and you can definitely see all of these criteria. So one of them is separation of any pages, any fingerprints or smudges, any wrinkled corners, or any even coffee and tea stains. So you can kind of tell on which page the readers stopped reading. What was the last page that was read? And it turned out in the 2008 study, they analyzed books in Spanish, Portuguese, German, Chinese, Italian, and Cantonese. And it turned out that wear and tear index, which is how many pages have been read, that the textbook readers only read 16.8% on average, and the maximum was 27%, which is really not much, only maybe a chapter or two of each of these books. Now that we know this is the case in all these other languages, we also wanted to see how it is like in Farsi. And it turned out that it is even less. It is only 5%. As you can see, the total of pages, we have anywhere from 160 to about 300 pages. And if you see the last page that was actually read, maybe 5 pages, 10 pages, very, very few pages were actually read. And that also tells you that these books are not helpful for heritage language development and acquisition. Now that we know what the problems are, I think it's very important as teachers and researchers to look for solutions that actually work. And since we started with a story, I'm going to end with a story. And as you can see the picture, many of you might have already read this book. It's a book called The Missing Piece by Shel Silverstein. And it's the story of this incomplete circle that is looking for that little missing piece that it has. And it goes to all of these different places trying to find that missing piece. In this picture, it has found that missing piece. But that's what we want to do with our heritage language acquirers. As this quote that you see above also mentions, and I heard this not only about Farsi, I've heard it about all these different languages, and it was echoed in different ways, but I really like this quote, so I put it here. I'm going to read it for you. Oh, so I'm going to take this one out so that you can see. So when they get older is when they usually come in to the bookstores. They go to graduate school at UCLA or another university in their 20s and 30s. They realize that they can't speak their mother tongue. That's when they start coming to get books or take Farsi classes. They realize that a piece of them is missing. So what can we do to help these heritage language acquirers find that missing piece? We can provide optimal input, as Professor Krashen was giving more details about in his talk, by using stories, story listening, and reading. guided self-selected reading, or self-selected reading. So far, and again, just to give you an overview of what optimal input entailed. So we not only want input that is comprehensible, we also want input that is compelling, that is rich, and that is abundant. And so far, what we have been doing in heritage language development and heritage language classes, we have focused so much on advanced grammar classes and having students go over all of these alphabet and I mean, and I emphasize alphabet because Farsi is unique in a way that the alphabet that is used in Farsi historically had been changed to Arabic writing system. So the sound system and the letter representations many times don't match. So for example, there are 4 different letters for the sound Z, which is Z in English, but in Farsi, all of them are pronounced the exact same way. In Arabic, they are not. So that's one issue that Farsi heritage language acquirers struggle with a lot. And also the materials that are used are incomprehensible and uncompelling. What we can do, on the contrary, to help these heritage language acquirers is we can definitely still have heritage language classes. There are actually benefits, many benefits to having heritage language classes, but we can provide them with optimal input. We can have stories, story listening, teachers reading them out loud so that the students can just listen and get input, comprehensible input, guided self-selected reading or self-selected reading, meaning that students find books or reading materials that they find interesting, and guided meaning that the teacher can help them find those resources. And you can have some of the options that you can use in order to achieve that goal is having family history, again, connecting to the wisdom of the elders and the heritage culture and generations. And you can also use popular literature. Now, you can either use popular literature that is unique to that specific heritage language and culture, or you can use popular literature that is translated from English. So that kind of brings forth a context and makes the stories more comprehensible for them. So these are only some of the options, some of the little adjustments that we can make in order to make everyone's lives much easier, both heritage language acquirers and all of these families and generations that get blamed for not developing the heritage language. So with that, I am going to go to the selected references. You have some of the references here, and on the handout that I think has been shared in the chat box, you can also find many of these articles if you would like to read about them more.